The solicitor's office on Aldgate Street smelled of tallow and old paper, and Miss Cecily Holt stood at its threshold on the morning of the 19th of November with her gloves still damp from the rain and a certainty in her chest that something in this room was wrong. She had been summoned by Mr. Fenwick, her late uncle's man of affairs, to hear the reading of Sir Edmund Holt's last will and testament. The invitation had arrived 3 days after her uncle's death, and 2 days after his widow had taken possession of the house on Greville Square, which meant that Cecily had spent those 2 days in a borrowed room at her friend Harriet Vane's lodgings, washing her single, respectable gown and pressing it by firelight, while trying not to listen to Harriet's well-meaning counsel about making herself agreeable to Lady Holt. There was no agreeable position available to her. Cecily understood this, with the same plainness she understood the weather. She was 23 years old. She was the daughter of her uncle's younger brother, who had died without fortune when she was 11, leaving her entirely dependent on Sir Edmund's charity for her education. Sir Edmund had been a quiet, steady man who kept his affections private and his accounts meticulous, and she had believed, without being told to believe it, that he intended to provide for her. He had told her so 18 months ago, with a cup of tea in her hands and his study fire burning low. He had used the word comfortable, and she had held that word like a coal in her palm all the way home on the hired carriage. What she had not known, until she stepped into that office and saw the woman already seated beside the solicitor's desk, was precisely what Lady Holt intended. Lady Holt was 41, recently married to Sir Edmund in what the season had described as a late life arrangement of mutual advantage, which was the polite way of saying that her first husband's creditors had taken everything, and Sir Edmund's house in Greville Square had 12 bedrooms and an annual income of £4,000. She wore black mourning with an ease that suggested she had worn it before, and found it flattering. She was beautiful in the manner of cut glass, all angles and brightness, and she directed at Cecily a smile of such measured condescension that Cecily felt it as a physical pressure in the space behind her sternum. "Ah," Lady Holt said. "The poor relation." She said it as though naming a category of furniture, not cruelly, precisely. Only with the absolute confidence of a woman who had never needed to consider what the named party might feel, because the named party's feelings were not relevant to any arrangement she had made. The room adjusted itself around the phrase without flinching. Mr. Fenwick did not look up from his papers. The clerk in the corner went on writing. Cecily sat. She folded her hands in her lap, where the damp from her gloves had soaked through to her wrists, and she listened to Mr. Fenwick clear his throat and open the document on the table before him. What he read was not what she had expected. She had expected the will her uncle had shown her 18 months prior, in his study, on a December evening when the fire was low and he had pressed a warm cup of tea into her hands and told her that she need not worry about her future. He had explained the provisions. He had named figures. He had used the word comfortable, and she had noted the name of the solicitor who had drawn it, Mr. Cartwright of Lincoln's Inn, and the red wax seal with its oak tree device, and the 2 witnesses whose signatures appeared below her uncle's own. What Mr. Fenwick read instead was a document dated 4 months ago, 2 weeks after the marriage, in which the bulk of Sir Edmund's estate passed entirely to his widow. Cecily received an annuity of £60, £60 per year. Enough, if she was careful, to keep herself in a single hired room and 1 meal a day. Not enough for a companion, not enough for a hired carriage, not enough for a season. Not enough for anything that resembled the life she had been, quietly, reasonably, non-extravagantly preparing to live. She had been planning to take lodgings near enough to Harriet's to walk, to keep perhaps 1 decent gown and 1 day dress, to purchase a subscription to the lending library, to put aside a small sum each quarter against the future. All of this had been, until this morning, achievable. She did not make a sound. She registered the room, the tallow smell, the gray light from the window, the precise angle of Lady Holt's profile as she received the news of her inheritance with a stillness so perfect it could only have been rehearsed. Cecily's hands remained folded. Her breathing did not change. She thanked Mr. Fenwick in a level voice, rose from her chair, and walked out into the rain. She stood on Aldgate Street for 3 full minutes, letting the rain soak into her pressed gown, before she understood what she was going to do. She was going to need to find the original will. She had reason to believe it still existed. Her uncle had been, above all things, an orderly man. He had shown her the document 18 months ago because he was the kind of man who showed documents rather than simply describing them. She had seen his signature, his seal, the name of Mr. Cartwright of Lincoln's Inn who had witnessed it. She had not copied it, because there had been no reason to copy it then. What she had retained was the precise arrangement of the page, the quality of the parchment, the red wax of the seal with its oak tree device. She had also retained the knowledge that her uncle maintained a second set of records, a habit formed during his years in commerce, in a locked cabinet in the library at Greville Square. He had told her this offhandedly, in the manner of a man who forgets what he has disclosed because he trusts the person he is disclosing it to. He had shown her where the household accounts were kept, in the event she was ever needed to manage them in his absence. The cabinet was positioned on the south wall, below the section of shelves given over to his ledgers, and he had opened it twice in her presence to retrieve papers, and she had noted, because she was the sort of person who noted things, the small key fitted into the decorative device of his seal ring. She was not certain the copy was there. She was not certain of anything, except that she was standing in the rain on Aldgate Street with £60 a year and the memory of a document she had once been shown. The Greville Square house was no longer hers to enter without invitation. This was the difficulty that occupied her mind for the rest of the afternoon and the early part of the following morning, and might have occupied her considerably longer had not Harriet Vane arrived at her room at 10:30 with a small piece of intelligence she had gathered from her brother, who was a clerk at the Court of Chancery and made it his business to know the affairs of anyone who might eventually require the court's attention. "Oliver," Harriet said, settling herself on the edge of the room's single chair with the air of a woman delivering a verdict, "says that the will presented at the reading was filed with the court last week. He also says that Mr. Sudbury, Cartwright of Lincoln's Inn, who was witness to your uncle's previous document, has been asking questions." Cecily looked at her across the narrow room. Beyond the window, the grey London morning moved in its ordinary way. The hackney carriages and the coal cellars and a woman shouting from a window across the yard. None of it had changed. Everything had changed. "What sort of questions?" she said. "The sort," Harriet said carefully, "that a man asks when he believes the document he witnessed has been set aside without proper grounds." Something settled in Cecily's chest. Not comfort precisely. More like the recognition of solid ground under uncertain footing. She went to call on Mr. Cartwright the following day. He was a lean man in his late 50s, with the patient eyes of someone who had spent a career reading what documents revealed and what they concealed, and when she explained who she was and why she had come, he was quiet for a long moment before he said, "Miss Holt, I had hoped someone would come." He had a copy, not of the new will, which he had not witnessed, and of which he had known nothing until it was filed. He had retained the original, as was his custom with all documents he considered of weight, because he had taken one look at the new will when it appeared at the court, and felt, in the way of a man whose practice had made him careful, that something was not as it ought to be. He had gone back to his own records. He had found what he had kept. He had begun asking questions. The new will, he told her, bore the correct form and the correct signature. He could not say with certainty that it was fraudulent. What he could say was that the signature had been executed with a slight tremor inconsistent with the Sir Edmund he had known across 15 years of business, and that 2 of the witnesses named were men connected to Lady Holt's first husband's household, rather than to Sir Edmund's own. "It is not proof," he said. "It is suspicion, and suspicion, in Chancery, is a slow and expensive thing." Cecily understood this. She understood it with the clarity of someone who had £60 a year, and no access to the house where the locked cabinet might or might not contain what they required. She sat across from him in his quiet office and calculated what was within her reach. She could write to the witnesses. She could request access to Greville Square on some pretext. She could do either of these things and very likely achieve nothing. Because Lady Holt was not a woman who had worked this carefully, only to be undone by a polite letter. The witnesses would have been chosen precisely for their reliability, and access to the library would be refused before she reached the threshold, if Lady Holt had any cause to suspect she was looking. She could also write to Lord Ashbourne. Richard Carew, Viscount Ashbourne, was her uncle's nearest neighbor at his country property in Westbridge, and the executor named in the original will, a fact that Cecily had noted when she first saw the document 18 months ago, and then filed away under things that did not yet matter. He had not been present at the reading. He had not, as far as she knew, been contacted about it. He was a man of some reputation in the county. He was 34 years old. The son of a judge, known for a particular kind of exactness in his dealings, that people described variously as integrity or severity, depending on whether it had worked in their favor. She had met him once, the previous winter, at her uncle's table. He had spoken very little, and listened with a precision she had found unsettling at the time. The way a man who reads documents for meaning listens to conversation. He had sat across from her at a dinner of 12 and asked her 2 questions about her opinion of the new acts concerning servants' wages, which no one had ever asked her about anything, and she had answered them honestly, perhaps more honestly than was quite comfortable. And he had nodded once in a manner she could not quite interpret, and then turned his attention back to his plate. She had thought about him occasionally, afterward, in the involuntary way one thinks about something one has not resolved, and had put it down to the strangeness of being asked a real question by a man who did not seem to require the usual answers. She wrote to him that afternoon. She stated the facts plainly, without apology and without embellishment. She named Mr. Day. Cartwright and his retained copy named the witnesses and their connection to Lady Holt's previous household, described the locked cabinet in the library at Greville Square, and said she believed the will presented at the reading did not reflect her uncle's intentions, and that she needed the executor named in the original document to assist her in establishing whether the original could be recovered. She did not say she was frightened, because she was not. Precisely. She was cold and wet, and short of funds and certain that something had been taken from her, and certainty, in her experience, was a warmer thing than fear. He arrived in London on the 4th day. She had not expected him so quickly. She had expected a letter in return, questions, the cautious progression of a man who managed his interests from a distance. He arrived instead in person, at 11 in the morning, on a grey Thursday, at the address she had given him, which was Harriet Vane's lodgings on Henrietta Street, and when Harriet ushered him into the small sitting room where Cecily was sorting through the papers she had gathered, she looked up to find him standing in the doorway in a dark traveling coat that still held the cold of the road. He was taller than she remembered. She noticed this, and then she noticed the set of his jaw, which was exactly as it had been at her uncle's table, closed and deliberate, the face of a man who had decided something before he entered the room. His attention came to rest on her, and then on the papers on the table with equal steadiness, and she felt, as she had felt at dinner, the specific quality of being genuinely looked at by someone who is actually looking. "Miss Holt," he said. His voice was level. "Show me what you have." She showed him. She laid out Mr. Pauld's, Cartwright's retained copy, the notes from her meeting with the solicitor, the letter from the Court of Chancery that Harriet's brother had procured through channels she had not examined too closely, her own written account of what she remembered of the original document from the reading 18 months prior, and the 2 names of the witnesses she had been able to trace through the Holt family's connections to Lady Holt's previous household. He read, without speaking. He read everything. In the same way he had listened at dinner, with his whole attention and without the restless gestures of a man who already knows what he thinks and is merely waiting to confirm it. He turned each page deliberately. He went back once to the notes from her Cartwright meeting and read a passage a second time, and she understood from the quality of his stillness that the passage concerned him. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked up at her. "The locked cabinet in the library," he said. "How certain are you that it contains a copy?" "Not entirely," she said. My uncle was methodical. He retained copies of every significant document as a matter of course. I observed this habit across 8 years of knowing him. I am not entirely certain the copy survived if Lady Holt understood what she was looking for, and understood it in time. She would have needed to understand that he had the habit. Yes, Cecily said, and I do not know whether anyone who knew his habits told her. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitant, quiet in the manner of a man arriving at a decision that had already been forming and had now found its shape. I was named executor, he said, of a will that has been set aside in favor of a later document. If the original can be shown to represent his genuine final intentions, the later document may be challenged. The question is whether the original can be found before Lady Holt understands that I am pursuing it. She will understand very quickly, Cecily said, once you call at Greville Square. Yes. He looked at her, and there was something brief and precise in his gaze, there and then contained, which is why I am not going to call at Greville Square. He paused. Then, you are! He explained without ceremony. As executor of the challenged document, his arrival at the house would immediately signal to Lady Holt that a formal challenge was in progress. Her man of affairs would be summoned. The library would almost certainly be restricted, the cabinet examined, its contents moved or destroyed before anything useful could be retrieved. Cecily, on the other hand, had a reason to call that was entirely ordinary. She had a right, which Lady Holt had not yet formally rescinded, to collect personal effects from the rooms she had occupied during her uncle's life. These were rooms on the upper floor. They contained nothing of legal weight. It was precisely the sort of errand that a newly dispossessed poor relation might be expected to undertake. The library was on the ground floor. He looked at the papers on the table. He did not look at her when he said quietly, "You need not do this. I can pursue the challenge through Chancery with what we have. It will be slow. It may not succeed. I am telling you this because you deserve to know the slower path exists, and because I will not send you into that house on my behalf, without your clear consent." She felt the precision of this. He had not offered reassurance. He had offered honesty. He was not managing her. The slower path existed. It might not succeed. She had £60 a year while it was tried. She straightened the edge of one page with her thumb, a small movement, the only one she permitted. When? She said. He told her 2 days hence. He would be at the corner of Greville Square at the hour she specified, in a hired carriage, and if she came out of the house with what they needed, he would be there. He said this with the same level precision he had brought to the papers, as if the plan was already settled and the only remaining matter was the execution of it. She walked him to the door. On the step, with the rain resumed in the street behind him, he paused and looked back at her. And she had the sensation she remembered from the dinner table of being looked at by someone who was reading something she had not intended to write on her face. "You are not afraid," he said. It was not quite a question. She considered this honestly. "I am afraid of failing," she said. "Of the house I am not." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, so brief she might have imagined it. "Edmund spoke of you," he said. "He did not tell me everything. He told me enough." Then he turned and walked into the rain, and she stood at the door for a moment after he had gone, with his last sentence still in the air around her. She had not known her uncle had spoken of her at all. If you have ever stood on the threshold of something that cannot be unmade, and felt the weight of it settle into your bones rather than your thoughts, you will know something of what Cecily felt on the morning of the call. She dressed carefully in her second-best gown, not the pressed one, because the second-best had once been worn to a dinner at Greville Square, and so carried a legitimate association with the house. She carried a small basket for the personal effects she would retrieve from the upper rooms. She walked from Harriet's lodgings because the morning was clear and cold, and she needed the air. Lady Holt received her in the drawing-room. It was unchanged since her uncle's time, which was somehow more difficult than if it had been altered. The same blue silk on the chairs, the same writing table positioned at the window where the morning light fell across it, the same painting of Sir Edmund's father above the fireplace. Lady Holt sat beneath this painting in a morning dress of dark gray that suited her considerably better than the morning black had done, and she looked at Cecily across the carpet with that particular species of sympathy that is indistinguishable from contempt. "Miss Holt," she said, "how generous of you to call. I had not expected it so soon." "I hope to collect a few items from my rooms," Cecily said. "I shall not take long, of course." Lady Holt's gaze traveled across Cecily's gown, her gloves, her basket, with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman who is very certain of her own position. "Poor thing. I imagine the arrangements have been rather difficult." This was the second voicing of the category. Cecily heard it, and registered it, and did not change her expression by a single degree. "They have been simple enough," she said. "I was fortunate in my friends." She was permitted to go upstairs. Stare. The butler who escorted her was a man called Graves, who had been in her uncle's service for 11 years, and who had, in Cecily's experience of him, a quality of loyal attention that most men of his station directed at their employer, and that Graves had directed, unusually, at anyone in the house who had treated him with common respect. He opened the door to her rooms without speaking. In the doorway, Cecily said very quietly that she needed to return a book to the library before she collected her things. Graves looked at her. He was a man of 60, with gray whiskers and the unrevealing face of a good servant who had learned across 11 years of service to distinguish between the requests of people who deserved to be helped and those who did not. He was quiet for 3 full seconds. "The library," he said finally, in a voice of precise neutrality, "is empty at this hour. Lady Holt is in the drawing room until 11 o'clock. He paused. "The Morning Post has just arrived and will occupy her." He said nothing more. He turned and walked back to his station at the head of the stairs, and Cecily understood that this was the only assistance he could give her, and that it was in its quiet way everything. She went to the library. The room was, as she remembered it, with floor-to-ceiling shelves that her uncle had spent 30 years filling, the smell of tobacco and old leather still present in the curtains, the long table where he had worked spread now with Lady Holt's household accounts. She did not pause to look at any of it. She went directly to the south wall, to the low cabinet beneath the shelves, given over to his ledgers. The cabinet was locked. She had expected this. She had also come prepared. Among the personal effects she had every right to collect from the upper rooms was a small signet ring her uncle had given her 2 years ago, explaining that it was a duplicate of his own seal ring, made for her in the event she ever needed to manage his correspondence when he was unwell. She had done so twice, once in the winter of 1815, and once the following spring, and the ring had lived since then in the small leather box at the bottom of her dressing case. The ring contained, fitted into the band's interior, a small key that opened several household locks. The cabinet opened smoothly with the particular ease of a mechanism regularly maintained. Inside, precisely where she had expected it to be, in the section of the cabinet her uncle had reserved for personal documents as distinct from commercial ones, was the leather folder she had seen him use on the evening 18 months ago when he had shown her the will. She opened it with hands that were steady, because she had decided they would be. There was the parchment, in Mr. Cartwright's clear and careful hand, dated 14 months before the document now filed with the Court of Chancery. There was the oak tree seal. There were the witnesses' signatures, among them Mr. Cartwright's own, undisturbed. She also found something she had not expected. Inside the folder lay a note in her uncle's own handwriting, placed inside the folder as though kept for reference. She read it where she stood, not touching it longer than necessary. It was dated 3 months before his death, and it said, in its entirety, "I have been asked to amend the will. I have told them I will consider it. I have not told them I have already placed a copy with Cartwright, and a second, in the library cabinet, as I have always done. I trust this will prove sufficient. I have written to Ashbourne." She read it twice, in the quiet room with the smell of her uncle's tobacco around her and the sound of Lady Holt's household moving at its business beyond the door. She felt a particular grief of it, the fact that he had known what was being attempted and had moved, carefully and without drama, to prevent it. He had trusted the rightness of what he had done. He had trusted that the copies would be found by someone who would know what to do with them. He had trusted she understood that she would find them. She placed the note back inside the folder with the will, put the folder inside the basket beneath her uncle's copy of Cowper's poems, which were legitimately hers and had been left in the upper rooms. She relocked the cabinet. She fitted the key back into the ring. She returned upstairs and spent 20 minutes gathering the few remaining items from her old rooms, folded her uncle's Bible into the basket alongside the poems, thanked Graves at the head of the stairs, and walked out of the house on Greville Square at 10:15. Lord Ashbourne was at the corner in a hired carriage, as he had said he would be. When she climbed in and settled across from him, she set the basket on the seat beside him without speaking. He opened the folder and read. She watched his face, which did not change in the manner of a man performing composure, but held its discipline the way a well-trained thing holds still, with something working underneath it. At the note in her uncle's hand, the line of his jaw tightened briefly, and then released. He closed the folder and held it. "He had written to me," he said. "In October, I believed it was a general inquiry about some county business. I did not understand then what he was telling me." Cecily looked at him across the narrow carriage. The hired seat was worn at the edges, and the springs were uneven, and the morning light came through the small window and fell across his hands where they held the folder. "You could not have known," she said. "No." He was quiet for a moment, and she understood from the quality of his stillness that this was a grief, specific and earned, not a performance of it. He had not arrived at this too quickly. He had sat with it on the road from Westbridge, and had not resolved it before he arrived. "I was occupied with other matters in October. My own household had claims on my attention that I had been slow to discharge." I did not read his letter carefully enough. She did not ask about the other matters. She had the sense that they were real, and she had the sense that he would not use them as an excuse. And she thought that these two things together said more about him than most of what a person could learn in a dinner of 12. The carriage moved outside the window. Greville Square receded, and gave way to the ordinary London streets. "What happens now?" she said. "Cartwright presents the challenge," he said. "The note is material. It establishes that he knew of the attempt and took deliberate steps to preserve the original document. With 2 copies in evidence and a note in his own hand describing his intentions, the challenge has grounds." He paused. "It will not be immediate. Chancery moves at its own pace. There will be months of uncertainty. How long?" He looked at her directly. "Months. Perhaps a year. Lady Holt will contest it. She has resources, and she is not without counsel." She absorbed this. A year on £60 in a hired room, waiting for a proceeding she could not control and could not afford to hasten. "Is there anything I can do," she said, "to accelerate it?" Something shifted in his expression. Not softened, exactly. Altered. In the way a face alters when a man who has been keeping a question in reserve decides to ask it. "Yes," he said, "you could consent to be under my protection for the duration of the proceeding, as my ward, or as my betrothed." He was very still. "Both have legal weight. The second has considerably more. It would give you standing in the matter that £60 a year does not." The carriage was quiet for a moment. Cecily was aware of the folder in his hands, and the sound of the horses on the cobbles and the cold that came through the window's imperfect seal, and the fact that he had not looked away from her while he said it. "You're betrothed," she said. "It would provide you legal standing to access Sir Edmund's estate during the proceeding, should that prove necessary. It would also complicate Lady Holt's ability to have you removed from London, or discredited, before the case is heard." He was precise, and she understood that the precision was itself a kind of courtesy. The refusal to dress the proposal in sentiment it had not yet earned. "I am aware that it is not what you came to me for." She thought of the dinner table. The 2 questions. The way he had listened to her answers with his full attention, and then turned back to his plate, and the way she had spent the carriage ride home afterward trying to determine what he had made of what she had said, and whether it had mattered to him at all that she had been honest rather than agreeable. "My uncle spoke of me to you," she said. "He did. What did he say?" He was quiet for 3 seconds. She counted them. "He said," Richard Carew said, his voice level and not quite, this time, without warmth, "that you were the best of his family, and that he hoped very much you would find someone worthy of you." Cecily held this for a moment. The carriage turned, and winter light came briefly across his face, and she understood that her uncle had not said this carelessly, had not said it to anyone who did not already have some particular reason to hear it. "The second option," she said, "the betrothal." He nodded. Once in the way she remembered from the dinner table. Not triumph, not relief, or not only relief. Something more careful than either, held in the same discipline as everything else. They came to an understanding in the carriage, formal and plain, and Cecily thought later that this was exactly like him, that he had not confused the moment with the feeling that was gathering beneath it, and that she had not needed him to. She did not love him yet. She would come to understand this later, when she had the distance to see the shape of what had been forming since the dinner, since the note in her uncle's hand, since the morning he had walked out of the cold road into Harriet's sitting room and read her papers with his whole attention. She had not needed to love him first. She had needed to trust him, and she did, and the love was building itself quietly beneath the trust the way a room is prepared for winter, steadily, without announcement. The hearing in Chancery took 9 months. In those 9 months, Cecily lived at Lord Ashbourne's townhouse under the chaperonage of his aunt, a brisk woman named Mrs. R. Carew, who had firm opinions about propriety and considerably warmer ones about women who managed their own affairs. Mrs. Carew informed Cecily on the 3rd day that she was nothing like what she had expected and considerably more sensible than her nephew had led her to anticipate. And Cecily took this as the compliment it was intended to be. The house was comfortable in a way that had nothing to do with its furnishings. It had the quality of a house where work was taken seriously, where the accounts were kept in good order and the servants' wages paid on the proper date, and no one was asked to perform the useful fiction of not knowing what they knew. Mr. Cartwright presented the original will, the library copy, and the note in Sir Edmund's hand to the court in the first week of February. The witnesses named in the later document were examined, and under examination their accounts of the signing did not agree on several points, including the day of the week and the weather, which Mr. Sabb Cartwright observed in his submission was a difficulty for those who wished to be believed. Lady Holt's solicitor was a capable man who argued ably on her behalf, and there were 3 weeks in the spring when the proceedings seemed to hinge on a point of law concerning the validity of a copy document that Cecily did not fully understand, and that left her with a persistent tightness across her ribs that she was careful not to let anyone observe. During those 3 weeks, Richard came twice in the evening to the sitting room, where she sat across from her at the small table, and read. He brought his own papers. He did not discuss the case or offer reassurance. He simply occupied the same room with his attention directed at his work, and the tightness in her chest eased by a degree that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the particular quality of steadiness he carried with him. The same steadiness she had felt in the carriage and in Harriet's sitting room and at the dinner table. The quality of a man who knew what he thought and did not require anything in particular from the room around him. She told him once quietly that she did not need to be managed. "I know," he said, not looking up from the paper he was reading. "I am not here to manage you. I am here because I wish to be." She felt that sentence for 3 days afterward. The case was determined in the 3rd week of July. The will presented by Mr. Cartwright, supported by the library copy and the note in Sir Edmund's own hand, was found to represent his genuine and final intentions. The later document was set aside. Cecily was restored to the provisions her uncle had intended, which were, as he had said, comfortable. It comprised an annuity of £300, the use of his country cottage in Westbridge for her lifetime, and a sum settled in trust that removed the unrelenting arithmetic of survival from her daily calculations. Lady Holt bore the judgment with the same stillness she had brought to every public moment. Her face did not alter, her hands remained folded in her lap. Only when she rose to leave, when the room had already turned away and the legal business of departure was underway, did Cecily see, across the gallery railing, the single involuntary compression of her mouth, the adjustment of a woman whose entire confidence had rested on a document and who was recalibrating very quickly. She was not to be pitied precisely. She was to be recognized as a woman who had known exactly what she was doing and had simply encountered something she had not accounted for. The dinner at which the Westbridge County set assembled to mark the occasion was held in August, at the house of a family called Fowler, who had known her uncle and who managed their celebrations with the quiet satisfaction of people who had followed a proceeding closely and were glad to have done so. The rooms were warm and smelled of late summer flowers, and the candles were numerous, and the company was the particular kind that gathers around a restored order with genuine pleasure rather than mere relief. It was at this dinner that the third and final voicing of the label came. It was delivered not by Lady Holt, who was not present, but by her friend, Mrs. Pettigrew, who had her own reasons for resenting the judgment, and who said in a voice that carried rather farther than she might have intended to a companion near the window, that she supposed the poor relation had done well enough for herself, out of it all, considering. The room was not especially loud at that moment. The remark reached the ears of several people who had not been its intended audience. Lord Ashbourne, who was standing near the fireplace speaking with Mr. Pratis. Fowler went still in the way Cecily had come to know. Not a dramatic stillness. Not the stillness of a man composing himself for a scene. The stillness of a man who has heard something he has already decided how to answer, and is simply choosing the moment. He excused himself from Mr. Fowler. He crossed the room with the deliberate unhaste of someone who has measured exactly how much urgency the moment requires, and has settled on considerably more than none. He came to stand at Cecily's side, and he took her hand from where it rested beside her at her hip, and he said, in a voice that was level and clear, and that carried precisely as far as Mrs. Tree. Pettigrew and her companion. Cecily is my betrothed, Mrs. Pettigrew. I trust you will extend to her the courtesy that entitles. That was all he said. Mrs. Pettigrew's fan stopped moving. Her companion found something of great interest in the direction of the window. Around them, the room adjusted its understanding, with the quiet efficiency of rooms that have been waiting for this adjustment, and have known perhaps for some months that it was coming. Cecily felt his hand around hers, steady and warm and not releasing her, and she thought, with a kind of clarity that comes in very still moments, that she had been wrong about the timing of it. She had told herself she did not yet love him. She had been wrong about that for some time, and she had simply required this particular evening to understand it clearly. She looked up at him. He was watching Mrs. Beerley. Pettigrew's retreating back. Then he turned, and he looked at Cecily, and the expression on his face was private and direct and entirely for her and no one else in the room, and she felt it as something that had been waiting to arrive, the way a season arrives, not as an event, but as a condition. You did not need to do that, she said. No, he said, I know. He had not released her hand. Mr. Blainton, Fowler, with the excellent instincts of a good host, produced a toast at that moment and directed the room's attention elsewhere, and Cecily and Richard stood at the edge of the gathering with their hands still joined in the plain sight of everyone and requiring no concealment, and the room that had once taken Mrs. Pettigrew's word for what she was, quietly, entirely, revised its position. On the morning in October when they were married, in the church at Westbridge that had stood since before her uncle's father's time, the light came through the clear glass windows, in long pale shafts that fell across the old stone floor. Cecily wore her uncle's mother's garnets, which had been kept in trust with Mr. Cartwright's papers, and delivered to her with a note, in her uncle's hand, that said only for, when the time comes. She had held that note in the firelight the night before, reading it 3 times, and had thought of the cup of tea in his study 18 months ago, and the word comfortable. and the Oakwood seal and all the careful, quiet things he had done to make good on what he had promised her. She had not cried. She had sat with the note until it felt like company rather than grief. And then she had placed it with the leather folder in the small case she was carrying to Westbridge. That afternoon, the cottage was made ready. It was not a grand house, nothing like the 12 bedrooms of Greville Square. And Cecily did not want a grand house. It had a library, with good shelves and an eastern window where the morning light fell well, and a kitchen garden visible from the sitting room, and a fire that had been lit that morning and was burning with the deep, settled warmth of a fire that intends to last. She sat beside it in the late afternoon with the leather folder on her lap, the original will that had been copied and locked away, and quietly waited, the note in her uncle's handwriting tucked inside it. Richard came to the doorway and looked at her, and she looked up at him, and the look they held was the kind that has no need of translation. He came and sat beside her. The fire settled, and outside the window the kitchen garden lay in the October dusk, the last of the light turning the bare earth to gold before it went. She felt his arm against hers, and the warmth of the room around them, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to a life that has found its proper shape. She set the folder on the table beside her. She did not need to hold it any longer. Mr. Cartwright's clerk would collect it on Tuesday and file it where it belonged. It had done its work. Her uncle had trusted that it would, and he had been right. And she thought that being right about a thing like that, a quiet trust placed in a careful person and honored, was perhaps the best thing he had left her. The fire burned. Outside the window, the October dark came on. Slowly, the way it always did in the country. Not all at once, but by degrees. The sky going gray and then deep, and then finally and completely dark, and the cottage lit from within, warm and specific and named. If you carried her story with you tonight, she would ask for nothing more. Then that the folder is filed. The rest belongs to them.